Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this Signicat webinar on the EBA guidelines on the use of remote customer onboarding solutions. Let's start with some practicalities first. There is an option for you to submit questions by clicking on the tab questions, probably somewhere up there. You can use it, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. It might be that we touch some of the questions depending on the subject also while running the webinar. And there will be two poll questions. They will appear on your screen, and then just click the best fitting option. You can only choose one option, and then as we go, then we will take a look on the results together. And this webinar will be also recorded, so all the persons who have registered will receive the recording afterwards. And we will also send an email afterwards, and you can give feedback also by responding to that email. We will present this webinar together with Jon Ølnes. Hello, Jon.
Hi, folks. Hi, Antti.
Hello. So Jon, he works as a tribe lead and product manager within Signicat's Sign and Trust Services team. And Jon is one of the world's leading experts in technical standards and functionalities of trust services, meaning electronic signatures, identity verification, certificates, seals, and all of that. And Jon is also has been the editor of the Global Edge Standard 119461 around the security requirements for identity proofing for trust services. And this Edge standard, we will revisit that as we go. And my name is Antti Kela, and I will be approaching this topic from the compliance and regulations perspective. And I think together with Jon, we are a good team, or what do you think?
Absolutely.
I think high five, remote high five.
Yeah, that's good. Let's go.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And I'm based here in Espoo, Finland, and Jon is based in Oslo, Norway. So here we are. So we can have a look at the agenda. So we will start with the backgrounder and context around these guidelines and touch also other regulation frameworks. And then we will talk about the reasons why these remote onboarding related guidelines are needed. And then touch the, let's say, higher level harmonization of onboarding and other regulations in EU and also a little bit globally. And then we touch and discuss the timeline and recommendations, meaning the timeline of adopting the recommendations of these guidelines. And then the important question regarding how to comply from the credit and finance institutions perspective. We will take a look on the solutions available. And at the end, we will have the Q&A session. So feel free to submit questions as we go. So we could now take the first poll, actually. So you can select the best fitting option. Our marketing team is preparing the poll. There should be question around how familiar your organization is with these guidelines and alternatives here. And while providing the poll, we can actually now take a look on the context and background around the guidelines. So looking from a distance, we can think that this is simply only about technical functionalities and compliance, and that's it. But as probably most of you know, there is a lot of complexities and even politics behind and around these type of regulations. But although it's far from simple black and white, we can still think that this type of guidelines can be considered as a bridge in between the compliance and regulation domain and the technical functionalities domain. And this interaction and dialogue is very important. And if we think of the technical functionalities and the onboarding, of course, at the end of the day, in real life, the onboarding and among others, the friction or the possible friction is a very important factor for the credit and finance institutions, as ultimately these players are competing with each other. And when thinking of a consumer or business customer, then this friction is an important factor, as the customer might jump to another service provider regarding credit and finance services. So it's important, and we could now set the scene. So by definition, these guidelines fall under EU anti-money laundering directive. But when thinking of the other, just to name few in this slide, but looking at the other regulation frameworks like this Financial Action Task Force in the US, they have also actually pretty big power to impact on the regulations to be adopted, even with from EU perspective. So there's a regulation framework, and naturally there's this Payment Services Directive and eIDAS regulation and also other international standards. So when thinking of the harmonization, which is one important reason behind publishing these guidelines, the harmonization, it's actually an evolution over time. So it includes several drivers. And if thinking of this current situation when these remote onboarding guidelines have been published, just to name a couple of drivers which has an impact on the situation and in the guidelines even. In the AML space, the EU is preparing to establish a totally new anti-money laundering authority, AMLA, and it would should start in 2024, its work. And of course, there is a lot of preparation in establishing a totally new, very important authority. And when thinking of also the work which AMLA should do, so there is a need to leave room for the AMLA to prepare their own regulations. And then when thinking of eIDAS, there is eIDAS 2.0, which relates to the digital wallet and identity verification around them. So that has a touching point, and there will be new regulations from that domain also. So there is lots of different drivers behind it, and Jon will actually then talk about them in a minute, but we can first look at the players now that we got the the playing field. So naturally there is the EBA, and just for the sake of clarity, we are talking about the European Banking Authority. Sometimes people mix this with another EBA, namely the Euro Banking Association, but that's founded by the commercial banks, and those guys are running the payment clearing and all of that stuff. But we are now talking about the European Banking Authority, and it has a mandate to push new regulations, among others, through the competent authorities. So the competent authorities, they are the organizations for providing EU member state level national regulations and guidance. Of course, those guidances must be understandable, and basically they are to help credit and financial institutions to comply. And typically the local competent authorities are local financial supervisory authorities, meaning local FSAs, or then the local national banks. And naturally, the key players here are the credit and financial institutions who should comply with the regulations to stay away from money laundering and terrorist financing, and take care of all the KYC stuff also, and keep customers happy, and ensure that there's frictionless onboarding processes in place. And the fourth main player here are the RegTech vendors, and that's where us, Signicat, fall in that category. So basically there's quite a lot on competent authorities' plate. If we think of the collaboration towards the EBA and other national competent authorities, there is lots of politics around that, and regulation dialogue within the home country, and of course the dialogue with the organizations under supervision. So there is many tasks, and when thinking of the actual technical functionalities which these guidelines are actually touching, it's typically not the core objective of the competent authority to understand these modern technologies. So it's very interesting to see that these EBA guidelines actually provide information and recommendations on the practical level. So this is very, let's say, warmly welcome. Yeah, I can actually see one question already. Let me comment on that. So there was a question whether the UK entities or the Norwegian entities fall under this EBA. So yeah, the UK entities do not fall within the EBA scope, but there still are competent authorities in the UK who are kept in loop. It's the Prudential Regulation Authority and Financial Conduct Authority. And in Norway, yeah, through the EEA agreement, European Economic Area Agreement, and bilateral agreements, then Norway actually, yeah, they participate in the EBA. Yep. So why are the guidelines actually needed? So let me give a short backgrounder regarding the history. Short. It was in 2020 when the fifth AML directive was entered into force, and there this type of let's say identification was left totally on the responsibility of the competent authority to assess and decide whether some methods are okay or not. So there was a lot of room for interpretation there. And then in 2021, the EBA published revised guidelines around money laundering and terrorist financing risk factors. And that document actually contained a specific section around utilizing the innovative technological means around the identity verification. But unfortunately, the content of that section was pretty, let's say, thin. So there was room for interpretation also after that. But looking at the reasons derived from the previous, so the reasons for publishing the guideline documents are basically that the credit and financial institutions' compliance-related activities vary between EU member states. So that's an unfortunate fact, and of course that needs to be tackled. So yeah, the banks. But then naturally there are also bias or differences in between the competent authorities' national regulations. And as mentioned, now that we are having these modern technologies, there is a need for more practical guidance on how to utilize those. And then last but not least, we cannot only look at EU AML directive perspective. As mentioned, there are lots of other regulation frameworks, so there is a clear need for the cross-sector harmonization. So that is the scene now being set, and checking from our marketing whether we have the poll answers, or were we able to run the poll? Yes, okay. So that's interesting. What do you say, Jon? I think this was kind of, I think that's good to see that there's 20% that have started the evaluation of the guidelines. What do you say, Jon?
I think I think it seems like we have a competent audience and an audience that know what they're up to. And that could be good for you that already started the process. If you have questions, and you may post them also as comments in the question channel to see what experience you have, and if there is any feedback and advice you have looked into it.
Yes, and some 60% are not yet up to speed or are somewhat familiar with this topic, but this was more or less expected, but I think it was nice to see that 20% is already on or started the process. But shall we now take a look on the harmonization part, Jon?
Yes, we can. Looking at where we are and where we're heading, not only for financial services, but also more general in identity proofing, remote onboarding case. You mentioned this already, Antti, but today we have the anti-money laundering directives. And as a directive, these are implemented differently in the laws of the different member states. And also the directive is quite vague on what happens to customer onboarding. It says identifying and verifying the customer's identity basis of secure, remote or whatnot, regulated, recognized, approved or accepted by the relevant national authorities, right? So this is regulated in practice purely on national level, which means there are different national requirements for remote onboarding, and it's clear that this hampers the internal market for financial services. That's a clear effect of it. So next. EU is very aware of this problem, and we have the EU Digital Finance Strategy, September 2020, 4 priorities, and one of the top priorities is exactly remove fragmentation in the digital single market. This is what they're up to achieving. So next. What does it say on onboarding? It says remove fragmentation in digital signature market by enhancing financial service providers' ability to authenticate the identity of the customers, defining by means of technical standards of the European Banking Authority identification and authentication elements for customer onboarding purposes. Exactly. This points directly at the guidelines, right? And also, there's another aspect we don't touch much upon in this presentation, but it's also stated that they want to implement a legal framework that enables also customer data to be reused between financial service providers. So if you have done an onboarding to one provider, that information can be reused for another financial service provider. We're not touching upon it, but that's also a goal in this case. So next. Further, ensuring convergence of elements related to identification and verification for onboarding without the need to apply different processes or comply with additional requirements in each member state. So we are heading towards not only partial, but a complete harmonization in this case. And like stating what identity documents are needed to establish the identity and clarifying which technologies can be used. So if we look at the timeline on the next slide, this is what has happened at the EU level. They had an expert group working on Know Your Customer and financial services. So we got the status and in identifying the problems. Then in 2020, we got this digital finance strategy, which is a part of a bigger digital finance package, actually. And now, 2023, we got the EBA guidelines on remote onboarding, and we have the ongoing revision of the eIDAS regulation on electronic identification and trust services, which feeds into all the other stuff on how to use identity and signatures, trust services for financial services. So what looking into is an end state where you will, at least the state where hopefully in 2025, you will no longer have an anti-money laundering directive, but you will have a regulation, meaning a common EU law on anti-money laundering. And we see from the digital finance strategy a desire to harmonize the remote onboarding for AML through this regulation, or likely through an implementing act to the regulation. And by now, as a first step, we got these EBA guidelines that we're talking about today. And those are guidelines, and they are sort of normative, the way you're doing it. But it won't necessarily make all the member states change their ways of doing it due to the guidelines being published. So to enforce harmonization, you need a law, and that we will eventually get, but that will be more towards 2025. We also see that the AML regulation will provide this regulation of the reuse of customer data between financial service providers. So this is quite exciting. Some stuff is happening now, and much more will happen in the next 2 years or so. Next one. When we work on identity proofing, remote onboarding, we see mainly 3 areas that have quite similar requirements for a good level of identity proofing. Those are onboarding to financial services. It's issuing of EID, electronic identification means for authentication, and it's issuing of qualified certificates for signing. These are quite comparable in the requirements they need for proving the identity of a user. All these are today more or less subject to national rules, how you are allowed to do the identity proofing for one of these 3 areas. As Antti mentioned, I work in the ETSI ESI, European Telecommunications Standards Institute, Electronic Signatures and Infrastructure Group. And well, we found we need to do something about identity proofing for trust services, the qualified certificate case. And how do we harmonize? Well, we need to create a standard. There was no suitable existing standard, so we put one together, which is the ETSI 119461 on policy and security requirements for identity proofing for trust services. I'm editor and rapporteur for that standard, so we know pretty well what this is about. So if you do the next slide. This is standard, was published, it's close to 2 years ago. It published in July 2021, and it has taken an immediate effect. And it has also taken another intended effect of the standard, because if we look at the EBA guidelines, it's stated they are aligned with the ETSI standard. It's not like the ETSI standard can be directly applied in other areas than trust services, but it feeds into the work of EBA, and it also feeds into the work of CEN, assisted by ETSI, on how to do onboarding to upcoming European Digital Identity Wallet, and how to do onboarding in general to electronic identification means. So it's a core document that we believe is important also in the context of the EBA guidelines. So next one. That's it. It's over to you again, Antti.
Yeah, thanks. One quick comment. It's now possible to see these drivers also into the future. So once this AMLA institute would be established in 2024, then the idea would be that they would own this new coming AML regulation, which would have the big importance. So this is very interesting. But let's take a look now on the remote onboarding recommendations related timeline here. So so the clock started to tick when the EBA published the translations of the guideline, and that happened somewhere at the end of March, roughly. So and as a sort of background here again, so luckily there has been a lot of dialogue in between the EBA and the competent authority when preparing these guidelines, which is very good. So of course that type of dialogue happens behind the closed doors, and I have not been listening in, or Jon either. But anyways, what we know that the result of the guidelines is a compromise, and I would tend to believe that at least most of the member state countries are familiar with it, so they already more or less know the gap. As then thinking of 2 months forward, calculated from the translations, the competent authorities need to comment to the EBA whether the local regulations are compliant or not. So that would take place somewhere in May, June this year. But as said, the competent authorities should be more or less familiar on what type of gap there is regarding the guidelines and the existing regulations. And then from 6 months from the translations, meaning somewhere around end of the year, the guidelines become effective. And what is interesting is, of course, this compliance gap. So as the basic outcome of the compromise of the guidelines is that we can consider the guidelines as a sort of minimum level of requirements. And then there are countries that might potentially have even wanted more ambitious targets, or guidelines or regulation. But anyways, that's the idea, that most probably the advanced countries don't need to do much, but there are certainly countries that need to raise and increase their regulations to meet the level of requirements or recommendations mentioned in these guidelines. So this is really, really interesting situation, and thinking that the competent authorities, they need to communicate, as they have already, of course, been communicating towards the credit and financial institutions on the regulations. So the competent authorities, they provide interpretation documents, recommendations, regulations, and even they push for legislation. But basically, if there is a competence gap, and the regulations in a given country are kind of increased or enhanced, then of course there is a need for the credit and finance institutions to provide a assessment towards the competent authority to fulfill the compliance gap. And from that perspective, I think this time is perfect for credit and financial institutions to start getting familiar with these guidelines and start to evaluate the available technical functionalities and to prepare for the audit for the competent authority. So that was about the timeline. And then finally, let's look at the recommendations. So basically, we can say that the guidelines have five-ish different core elements. There is the identifying the consumer or business customer without requiring the physical presence, so for the remote onboarding. Then there is the recommendation around storing the data gathered during the customer onboarding. And these two topics are explained on a, let's say, practical and more or less detailed level, although this storing the evidence from the process, it's not that lengthy description, but it's important as that's something new here. Guidelines also touch money laundering and terrorist financing risk management, but that's only on a high level. And we know that there is lots of AML related things that the guidelines these guidelines does not touch. And these guidelines provide recommendations also around the monitoring after the onboarding, but that's also on a high level. And then also, lastly, it mentions the customer due diligence related process outsourcing, but that's also on a high level. So what we are going to do, we are going to focus on these two elements shown on the screen now. So now to the actual recommendations. So thinking of the identification of the customer. So basically, the guideline says that it's possible to use notified EID schemes, which are either substantial or high in the EIDAS level of assurance categorization. And that sounds clear, but there are EID schemes that are not notified. But anyways, it's more or less clear that if you have a national EID scheme which is on substantial level, that should be more or less okay. But then, actually, interestingly, there is another place in the guidelines which state also that other trust services and electronic identification processes are okay if they are regulated and accepted by national authorities. So might relate to the fact that there are countries where there are, for example, PSD2 compliant authentication used by credit and finance institutions. And as always, the recommendation is to apply risk-based approach. So this would be the minimum requirements, and then you naturally must and should apply more activities if the risk-based evaluation shows the need. But then there is also the ID document-based identity verification, and there are pretty clear recommendations there. So you can read the ID document information from chip, or you can have optical scanning or video there to be used to capture the data from the ID document. And there is a need to have a selfie, so the end user needs to take a let's say high resolution selfie, and there is the need to verify that the photo, the picture and video, picture or video are captured in real time. And there is a need to run a liveness check to ensure that the end user is there alive without and not showing a static photograph, for example. So you should perhaps smile or say some random numbers in a given sequence. And then, of course, there is the need to match, hopefully automatically, as there are these artificial intelligence powered technologies, to match and make sure that the selfie of the end user matches with the facial picture of the ID document there. So pretty clear, but this is new that it is now written in a guideline form. And potentially referring to Germany, there is possibility to add more methods on top of these. So for example, to run a payment transaction from a bank account, or get one-time passwords, or capture more biometric data if needed. And if we continue a little bit around the legal persons, this was not that deeply elaborated in the guidelines, but naturally the legal person, meaning the organization, needs to be identified and verified. And what is important, of course, that as there is a natural person who is representing the legal person there, then there is the need to make sure that this person has the right to represent. So that it could be in the form of signing rights, but that doesn't necessarily exist in all countries. But some type of authorization needs to be in place to formally make sure that the person has the right to act on behalf of the organization. And naturally, there's a need to identify the beneficial owners, and basically to have a review of the whole control structure behind the given organization. And these guidelines don't go into the details, but of course the typical requirements are there, like making sure what is the intended nature of business relationship with this legal person, etc. So that is the part of the identification. And now this interesting and new recommendation. So actually related to the fact or the topic which Jon also mentioned, like in the future, the possibility of reusing the onboarding and identity verification related data. So these guidelines give a recommendation that the data gathered from the remote onboarding process should be time-stamped and stored securely to be available afterwards for an audit or whatever afterward verification. So this is a very interesting piece of recommendation, as it's a new one, and there are existing technologies to make sure that this type of requirement is tackled, and the credit and finance institution can comply. So it's not a rocket science, but it's important to understand what does this mean and how you can comply. Okay, so now we are actually entering to the situation where we check the, you can take the previous slide still. I'll give a big short backgrounder here. So how to comply. So thinking of the kind of the methodology here. So I'll just give you one example, which is familiar to Signicat, meaning the requirement management. So if you take the regulation and you define the requirement from the kind of software business perspective, you have the functional and non-functional requirements, and you map, you know from where this requirement is originating from. So you know that, okay, it would be this certain regulation which imposes this type of requirement. And then when you think from the technical functionalities perspective, you should be able to identify what feature tackles that specific requirement and understand from what part of the platform or technology does that come from, so that you have the traceability of the requirements, so that over time you are able to make changes. So this could be one approach to meet and shake hands with the compliance and functionality part here. But yeah, now we can take a look on how Signicat can help here. So we can quickly comment on the EID scheme-based identity verification. So naturally we can help. We run the world's largest EID hub. You can see the geographics and the supported EID schemes, and we are implementing more in near future here. And this is easy to configure, easy to deploy. Pretty straightforward. Then we can take a look on the ID document-based identity verification. So we support several different technologies: image-based, video-based, NFC, reading the chip which is on the ID document, then different biometric techniques, liveness, face match, and of course then it's possible to combine different steps or different functionalities to have the desired result. So these are supported in 200 countries roughly. So basically it is a global reach, and we support globally this strong identity verification. Also when the end user doesn't have an EID scheme which would be used. So this is the identification part, and then perhaps Jon, you can comment on the storing of the evidence of the onboarding data.
Yes, actually, you mentioned the requirement of the EBA guidelines is that you should securely store and timestamp evidence of the process. And incidentally, Signicat has a brand new service that does exactly that. It is incidentally because when we planned this service, we didn't know anything about the EBA guideline, but it comes up with a neat use case for the service. And we have already one customer actually that uses this service this way to store evidence of an identity proofing onboarding process. So this is the digital evidence management, where we can, over the API, we can have an input of the record, what is to be stored, and also metadata defined by the customer. What we do is we add some system metadata standard for the service. We apply our qualified timestamping service, and we store this evidence for the duration requested. That's part of the metadata is time to live. How long will this be stored? And attached to this, there's a powerful search and retrieve based on the metadata, and you can validate the timestamp to prove the correctness. So it's quite easy if you say you onboarded this customer at this time, and your supervisory authority says, well, yeah, can you prove it? Yeah, we can. We can go to this service, we can retrieve the record, and we can prove by the timestamp, qualified timestamp, that yes, this stuff happened. This is what how it was done at this time. So that's a quite good one to fulfill the requirements for recording the evidence of the process.
Yes, and then let's take a more holistic view now around how to comply. So when thinking of these remote customer onboarding related guidelines, we can also at the same time comment on the guidelines around outsourcing arrangements. So we can proudly say that Signicat contract fulfills those requirements, and we help the credit and financial institutions to comply. So we mentioned the identity verification, and we also have this mobile biometrics authentication available, used by, was it like 800 banks, more on the PSD2 domain, this mobile biometrics authentication. Then, as mentioned, electronic signatures and timestamping and this digital evidence management. And we have not touched, but we'll just briefly mention that we provide access to more than 100 data sources for AML and KYC checks. So that's by nature also global, truly global. And then what you need to orchestrate the different workflows that touch the front end, meaning the end user, and you need to orchestrate the workflows at the back end, meaning what type of check, what method, what data source, what type of information you need to get to have the data points needed around the customer you want to check. So we have a no-code design tool set for the workflow management. We are talking about trust orchestration and flow tools. And what is actually very important also, and many times forgotten, that when thinking of the outsourcing arrangements, as an example, and the CDD outsourcing, which is mentioned in these guidelines, is that the platform of a RegTech vendor or the third-party outsourcing provider, the platform needs to be compliant. Well, luckily we have that also. So we have the needed security certificates around ISO, and then so that would be the kind of metaphor for having a lock. And then SOC 2 proves that we are able to utilize, and we show how we use the logs there. So and naturally we have the audit reports available for you, and we have 4 different qualified trust service provider statuses under eIDAS. This qualified timestamping is one, and perhaps one worthwhile mentioning is this qualified certificate topic. And we provide the possibility to have the physical access to the data center, and all the audit reports also here. So this is what we can cater, and this is how we can comply. And I think we could take now the second poll. Time is flying. We have some 10 minutes. So let's take the second.
We also have a number of questions, but we can do the poll first.
Yeah, let's quickly check the poll so that you can start responding to that. So you can just select again the nearest option for you. You can only choose one. We'll take a look on the results then at the end. But meanwhile, yeah, we can actually then start to look at the questions.
Yeah, I could do the first one, which is on the reuse of information, of identity information. It's not really reuse of EID for authentication, because that can be done. It's actually about reuse of the customer data, the verified customer data. So you could say, I'm about to sign up for an insurance company. I got all my identity information properly verified by a bank, so I can authorize the insurance company to get the identity information from the bank. Either technically, we don't know how that will be done. It could be directly arrangement, or it could, of course, in the longer run, be via my European digital identity wallet. So I could use already verified, so I don't need to go through a complete new process each time I sign up for a new financial service provider. Under certain conditions, it can be reused. Yeah, there's also one on standardization of legal person verification. The ETSI standard covers also legal persons, identity proofing of legal persons, and natural person representing legal persons, but it will be too much to go more into detail on exactly what the requirements are, I think.
Yeah, I can take one here. Luckily, there are lots of questions, but we don't have time to tackle all of them. One question is that how do I know whether my organization needs to comply with these guidelines? And this person says that we need to comply currently with the EBA ICT and EBA outsourcing. Basically, I would say that the competent authority needs to first digest these EBA guidelines and then approach the organizations who they are supervising. So I would tend to say that you will hear from your competent authority, but most probably you need to comply. But of course, that's up to the competent authority to decide.
Yes, I would add to that if you are subject to the AML directive, AML rules, then these guidelines are relevant to you. But you need to reach out to the competent authority to figure out what does it mean in my country. Will it be like if I'm compliant with the EBA guidelines, am I good to go in my country, or are there different rules that we need to look into in this case? We got one question on which data centers Signicat uses. That's a mix. We are using partly a private cloud operator in Norway. We are on our way to put all services on Google Cloud in Europe and strictly controlled. But we will also maintain a private cloud offering, localized offering in the longer term. So I hope that answers the question in this case. Yeah. What else do we got?
Yeah, let's see. There's one question around the whether the end user, the biometrics. Let me check that one. Whether to provide biometric data or not. In some countries, do you need to give an end user an option on whether to provide biometric data or not? If I got it right, my interpretation of the question is that whether the end user can use biometrics or not. Well, to my understanding, it is, let's say, normal practice that end users can use the physical ID document and also in that process apply biometrics, meaning the the facial pictures and all of that, if I got it right. So that should be okay from that side.
Yes, I think in this case, this case, it's defined like you do remote onboarding using an identity document. You need the picture from the identity document, and you need a photo of your face, and you need to compare them, which could be a manual comparison. It could be, in some cases, an automated biometric verification. And maybe in many cases, it will be a combination of the two. There will be a biometric verification supplied with a human judgment on top of it.
Yes. Okay.
Frequency of customer identity data updated is not covered by these guidelines. That's AML directive in itself.
Yeah, and basically the market practice tend to go even on a daily level here. So that means, of course, that you need to have automation in place. And of course, you cannot only rely on automation. You need to test and make sure that the automation part runs as expected. But it's more or less important to have automation there to allow this type of frequency.
Yes. When do companies need to start following this new guideline? Is there any grace period after the guidelines become effective? Essentially, I would say not entirely clear, but my answer would be this is up to the competent authority in each country. So you need to check with your competent authority how these guidelines will apply to you.
Yes.
And if they imply any change to the existing situation or not. And likely in many countries it will be a change. That's our anticipation.
Yes. Okay, time is flying. I think we could take a look on the results of the second poll and then start landing towards the end. Okay, are you planning to improve identification and evidence storing related processes? Okay, need to know more. Half of you would need to know more. And it's of course important that the competent authorities come out and tell to the local financial institutions on what needs to be done. But basically, it's like, regardless of the fact that the guidelines are written in the form of recommendation, I think these can be considered as a regulation, more or less.
Yep. I think I can mention one more question there. What services we provide, it's a bit on the side, but what services we provide to identify, collect universal ultimate beneficial owner information. So we can do register lookups in the registers that are mandatory to be established. It gives us so-and-so data quality because it's only self-reporting from the companies. We do also have a more comprehensive service where we cooperate with a company called T-Rank, and they use the database information services of Bureau van Dijk to analyze shareholding information and others, and to really do automated analysis, thorough analysis to come up with real beneficial owners information. That would be more than just owning more than a certain percentage of the company. It would be actually you own less, but you somehow have a controlling position in the company. So that's a quite good service that we can offer if you really want to do it in a thorough way.
Yes, and I'm afraid we need to start ending. Very nice to see that there is lots of questions, and we can think of potentially arranging a separate webinar to tackle on the, let's say, more detailed level questions. But
and of course we are also available, Antti, if there is something.
And our contact details are attached. But let's look at the upcoming events quickly. Jon, you will be attending this May 10th event, EU Cybersecurity Agency. So you would gather and be actively also having an impact on that domain. So that's something where we gather market insight also. And then,
yes, and also it's the coordination for standardization and alignment on essentially biometrics, but it's a little bit more than biometrics. Yeah.
Yeah. And the 16th of May, we have our own Signicat webinar around mobile identity and payment wallets, mentioned already earlier in this webinar, these EIDAS 2.0 related topics, digital wallets. And then just to mention the end of May, 1st June, there is a RegTech workshop arranged by the EBA, and the target audience is only the competent authorities, so it's invitation only. But I was lucky enough to be invited by the EBA to be one of the RegTech representatives there. So looking forward to that event and to gain more understanding around the markets also from there. But I think we are now ready to thank you. Here you can see our contact details. You will get the recording. And it really has been a pleasure. Very nice, positive surprise that there's been so many questions. And we will get back with those. And I don't know, Jon, we should just thank the audience and wish you all a nice day from onwards.
Yes, I hope you got a good value for the got a good value for from your participation and at your service. Should there be anything else you want to discuss with us?
Yeah, at your disposal. Thank you.